We're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and stand, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Dean Cavaretta, who is an educator like myself. I am Cecilia Delgadio, the face behind Core Concerns in Hopkinton, although we only got ourselves together in the last few weeks, kind of just met each other haphazardly, and then we found out that there is a Common Core Forum, which is made up of parents and teachers throughout the state. This is something that's happening all over, and I'm sure they will fill you in on that. So Dean is a graduate of Acton-Boxborough Regional High School, holds his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Northeastern, Framingham State College's for his teacher licensure, and is certified teacher in secondary history and political science, and he's coached and taught in the Lexington, Ashland, and Boxborough schools. Acton and Boxborough.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to be in Hopkinton. Thank you for coming out tonight and having this forum in such a nice community room such as tonight's venue. Fantastic to be here. I wanted to give everyone a brief overview of our schedule of events, and as more people come in, which is always a good sight to see, we have a distinguished panel that will talk about Common Core and its impact both on Massachusetts and across the country. We will have the panelists speak for 15 minutes each. We will welcome other people to our program approximately 7:55. I'll make a judgment call at where we are in the discussion to do that. We will then move to questions. I know Hopkinton is open town meeting like my hometown of Acton, so I'm sure everyone is going to be thinking of good questions to ask our panel and to talk about. And I would ask that you stand and we will recognize you. Do we have a microphone? Okay, so we do have microphone capability. For those of you like myself who have taught, we're used to speaking and speaking loudly. I'm a coach, former coach at Acton and Concord Carlisle, which are crosstown rivals. So I get to work with students from both sides of the aisle, so to speak. That brings up a good point at the beginning here. I am volunteering my time for the Common Core Forum, which is a civic organization that we'll learn more about tonight from Donna Colorio. But you know, in my first year of teaching, I learned about the importance of fairness. And when you teach 8th grade history like I did, it's very important that all students have a sense of fairness, that they all be recognized, that we listen to all sides and we give everyone an opportunity to participate. So that's my goal as moderator here tonight. So again, it's great to be here to talk about public education, something that I'm passionate about since I've lived ed reform as a teacher. Okay, so with that, I will introduce our panel. Jamie Gass is Pioneer Institute's Director for the Center of School Reform. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education reform at the state municipal levels. Previously, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as a senior policy analyst, technical writer, and in the state budget office. Please welcome Jamie.
Thank you, Dean, and I want to thank Celia and all of you for coming out. This is, I think, an incredibly important topic, and we really appreciate you coming out and getting some education information about it. And you're in for a real treat because Sandra Stotsky is really one of the preeminent experts on academic standards in this country, and really one of the few people whose standards can have correlated with remarkable gains in student achievement on both national and international tests. So let me give you a little bit of historical context. The founding fathers were very wise. They understood that the national government can do lots of great things in terms of defense and foreign policy and trade, but that most of the domestic issues that most intimately connect our lives, particularly things like schooling, were really left better at the state and local level. And The state constitutions, Massachusetts included, which is the oldest written constitution in the world, is very, very specific about it. There's a couple of paragraphs written by John Adams in 1780 called the Cherish Clause, and it talked about how it's the interest and the responsibility of future legislators and citizens to cherish the interests of literature and mathematics, and that how education and public education serves as the wellspring for supporting our republic and our commonwealth. And so while the state constitutions are very specific, the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention it at all. And that really has been both the custom and the practice and the legal outlook of education in this country for well over 200 years. It really has taken really a small collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard and catapulted us to being the most powerful country in the world. It's no small accomplishment. But sometime, shortly after World War II, people began to notice that the quality of public education was declining in this country. It became evident in the late 1950s when, in the space race, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and people began to get concerned, particularly in our area of international competitiveness and preparation in math and science. So much so that by 1983, there was a report called A Nation at Risk. It was commissioned by the Reagan administration that talked about all the decline. We really had fallen from among the top performing countries in the world to about 15th or 20th. And it was concerned. And in fact, the report said that if we had the system of public education that we have imposed on us by a foreign enemy, it would be an act of war. And so since that time, both in the Commonwealth and nationally, we have been having lots and lots of debates and lots of policy discussions about how to remedy this problem. And some people have thought that the way to do this is to set national standards and testing and curriculum from Washington, D.C., the way they do in some of the European countries and they do in some countries in the world. And other people have said, well, you need to inject more school choice and give parents and competition a chance, that the competition among the schools and the parental choice will help drive improvements. And what Massachusetts really did was quite different. In 1993, Republican Governor Bill Weld worked with two Democratic state legislators, Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt, to craft a landmark 1993 Education Reform Act, which put a great deal of additional state resources. We've spent over $100 billion at the state and local level since 1993 in exchange for all the difficult things, all the difficult policy measures that people in public education had generally not wanted to do. Things like high-stakes testing for a graduation requirement, you know that as MCAS. High-quality academic standards grounded in the traditions of English and math and science and history. And Dr. Stotsky was the architect of the very high-quality standards here in Massachusetts, and which really restored academics as the central role in education. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do hands-on learning. We weren't going to do all of the kind of fads that had driven the country and even our Commonwealth down in the previous decades. We're going to do some charter schools, which are basically independent public schools that are held accountable for their performance, and they can be shut down if they don't perform. Teacher testing, so the teachers were going to be tested on the same academic material in academic content areas like English and math as the students are. And that there would be a whole general system of accountability for all the adults in the system. And so while the rest of the country over the last 20 years continues to be stuck in various levels of stagnation and decline, the reforms that were put in place in the early 1990s in Massachusetts have led to historic gains on both national and international testing. Specifically, in 2005, Massachusetts was the first country on a test called the NAEP test, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, to score number one in every category, so reading and math, at every grade level tested, 4th and 8th grade. And then we did that again in 2007, 2009, 2011, and just recently, several months ago in 2013. So I like to say that it's really the equivalent of winning the World Series 5 times in a row and doing it in 4 games each time. It's a remarkable accomplishment that no one in K-12 education, either in the country or in Massachusetts, thought was going to ever be possible. It really exceeded the expectations of the architects of the ed reform. They were trying to meet the demand of this A Nation at Risk report and have a state-driven effort, not foisted on us by the federal government, that the people who are going to be doing the work, the teachers and the principals and the state policymakers and the legislators, were going to be paying for it and going to be doing the work, and that they needed to own the work. That's a big lesson for Massachusetts. But the Nation at Risk report was very clear. In order to compete in the 21st century, you have to be able to compete with Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan and South Korea, all the high-performing, largely East Asian countries. So in Massachusetts in 2007, tested it as its own individual country. It was the only state in the union, there was one other state, Minnesota, that tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test. It's the gold standard of international math and science test. And what TIMSS demonstrated was that Massachusetts 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science, which is a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. And then in the area of mathematics, we were among the top 4 or 5 countries in the world. So I always say that that's like winning Olympic gold medals, and we repeated that again in 2013. So that gives you a little bit of the context for this discussion on Common Core and how the race to become Race to the Top, which was basically a federal grant program initiated in 2009, was really the race to become Massachusetts. And what happened is that the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, these are 2 Washington, D.C. based trade organizations, they're lobby groups in Washington, D.C., took generous millions and millions of dollars from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to develop a set of uniform math and English standards, which are called Common Core, and they will be accompanied by national testing. So a test that Massachusetts will take will be the PARCC test, which will replace MCAS. And states across the union adopted these standards in the summer of 2010. So when most people were at the beach or having a barbecue or relaxing, having a good time, the Massachusetts Board of Education thought that that was a really good time to have a change in education policy that was going to impact 1 million school children. So needless to say, there was not a lot of debate, there was not a lot of discussion, there were no bills in the state legislature, there was no hearings, and they really kind of rammed this through. Well, I work for a place called Pioneer Institute. We're an independent, nonpartisan think tank in Boston. We had played a big role in the ed reform law and the key elements of ed reform, including the very successful charter schools that Massachusetts has. And we thought that given that Massachusetts had so much to lose in this discussion, that we had better take a look at the academic quality of Common Core to see how it's stacked up against Massachusetts and other high standard states. So we enlisted Dr. Stotsky on the English side, and then coupled her with a guy named Jim Milgram, who's a mathematician at Stanford University, who had worked on the very high quality math standards in California, and a Silicon Valley engineer. And they looked at, in these 40, 50-page evaluations, and they did 4 of them in about 6 months, and they looked at every draft of Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts and California and Minnesota and Texas and others. And what they found is that Common Core was of significantly lower quality than what Massachusetts had at every step of the way. They specifically, Common Core, ignored the evidence from Massachusetts in the area of reading, where the basis for our success was driven by our deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama. So things like Huckleberry Finn and Charles Dickens and Sherlock Holmes and Edith Wharton. The quality of the vocabulary and the language found in these texts are just better than what Common Core is offering. Common Core likes to shovel in what they call informational text, which can mean some good things like the Gettysburg Address, which probably really belongs in a history class, not in an English class. But also could mean things like Federal Reserve manuals and federal regulations and things like that English teachers who are trained in English and literature are going to have to start teaching bits and pieces of history and what they call informational text. On the math side, they ignored the evidence from Massachusetts and California and all the high-performing East Asian countries, and Common Core basically pushes back access to Algebra 1 to 9th or early 10th grade. In Massachusetts and California and high-performing countries, kids have had access to it in the 8th grade, which really puts the kids behind the 8 ball if they want to study the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, or mathematics. There's not really a pathway to get to calculus, pre-calculus, trigonometry, and that is, again, important if you want to be an engineer or in the STEM fields. And so they really ignored a lot of the evidence. There was not a lot of research basis for the decision they were making, and because they were driven by private trade organizations, there were no sunshine laws or accountability or any kind of public exposure for what it is that they were doing and the decisions they were making. We have no idea why they picked the people to write the standards. Dr. Stotsky will talk a little bit about their lack of experience doing that. And the fact of it is the trade organizations and the main advocates for Common Core in the last 20 years have very weak records in terms of improving student achievement or standards anywhere, frankly. I mean, it's really kind of appalling that this kind of authority would be given to people that are not accountable to the public and don't have great records. And then you ignore the evidence and the success of Massachusetts. So that's on the academic quality side. The next piece of research that we took a look at was the legality. Because the fact is that I mentioned at the beginning, under the law in this country, K-12 education is the proper legal jurisdiction of the states and localities. 90% of the funding for K-12 education in this country comes from the states and localities. The federal government contributes a very small amount. So what we did is we enlisted the 2 highest ranking lawyers in the federal government under the second Bush administration to look at the legal dimensions of it. And what they found is that there are 3 federal laws that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding or validating or directing or encouraging national standards testing and curricula, which is precisely what Common Core and the national testing does. Specifically, there's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which was signed by Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and then the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself in 1979, which was signed by Jimmy Carter. All 3 of these federal laws make it clear that the feds may not do the things that they have done under Common Core. It's remarkable that the people who are responsible for educating our children, the people that at a minimum are supposed to be inculcating basic principles of citizenship and help perpetuating our democracy, are in plain sight violating federal laws. The third piece of research that we have looked at related to Common Core is the cost, because even though at this point 44 states have adopted Common Core, the fact is, and it's true here in Massachusetts, most of the governors, most of the state budget office, most of the state departments of education, the boards of education who were the big advocates for this, none of them did a cost projection. So even though the states and localities are going to pay for 90% of it and pass that price tag and that cost onto the taxpayers, no one even bothered to find out what it was going to cost. As I mentioned, the Gates Foundation has spent over $200 million paying for the development of the standards, paying for the evaluation of the standards that they develop, paying organizations all over the country and a lot of the key players in and around education advocacy to push for it, but none of them took the time to find out what it was going to cost. So again, we're researchers, so we thought it'd be a good idea to take a look at it. And what we did is we got a couple of researchers who had experience in both Republican and Democratic administrations in Washington, D.C. They'd worked on Capitol Hill in federal budgeting, and they took a look at it. And the projection that they came up was that it's going to cost the states and localities about $16 billion to implement Common Core. Massachusetts is going to be about $360 million. Again, that's $360 million to implement standards that are just qualitatively lower and unproven in comparison to the ones that we already had. We know that the ones that we had led to historic gains on national and international testing. These standards are totally unproven. They have not really, they've just begun this year to pilot the testing in a couple of states, but they are really unproven. In that regard, it returns Massachusetts back to what we were doing in probably 1992, because they're entirely different. Whole new set of textbooks, all new training for the teachers, and there's going to be huge technology costs driven through Common Core and the testing, because the goal is to have all of the testing done online and not paper and pencil tests the way MCAS is. So that's giving you sort of a lot of bad news. The good news is that there's a handful of states, Texas being the most noted, and just today the governor of Oklahoma has signed a bill that pulls Oklahoma out of Common Core, and the governor of South Carolina just yesterday signed a bill that pulls South Carolina out. You're beginning to see states push back. But what has been really remarkable about this effort, and it's really driven by moms, and we've been to about 20 some odd states in the last couple of years, talking to state boards of education, talking to state legislators, providing testimony, doing forums in front of 5 people and in front of 900 people, is that most of the audience usually are women. They're usually moms and grandmothers who frankly do a lot of the homework with kids. And they're not so happy about it because no one told them about it, and they're seeing a lot of really poor quality math that they can't do. Their kids can't do it. I mean, I've begun to see it. I've got 2 daughters, and one of them is in school, and she came to me the other day and asked me, what is a Common Core math journal? And I said, I don't know. I've been studying this for 4 years and looking at this day in, day out. I had never heard of that before. But what it is that kids will be writing about mathematics, not doing the kind of standard algorithms that all of you did and that people have been doing for generations. And there's a lot of craziness that has been pushed through this. And there's a lot of other agendas. We just did another paper about a week or 2 ago on the data collection, because running parallel to Common Core, it's not in the standards themselves, but it runs parallel to it. And it was really states adopted what they call longitudinal data collection systems. So they're going to be starting to collect about 400 pieces of data on our children. What we know from Massachusetts is that you need about 10 pieces of data to improve student achievement. It's all academic data. It doesn't have to do with socioeconomics or a lot of the other issues that they want to gather data on. And there are federal laws that prohibit them from doing that. The federal government, there are FERPA laws. They're basically parental privacy laws. And they've brushed those aside. Those have been brushed aside in the last couple of years to make access for really what is a large workforce development system. What the goal of the people who are driving this are into is not to develop citizens or to develop critically thinking folks. They want to develop workers, and they want to have as much data and information on your children, academic and otherwise, so that they can start to direct your children to the kind of careers that they think the economy needs. I work for a think tank that's a free market think tank, and I know that the history of this country is driven by people having choices about what it is that they want to do with their careers, not having, unelected bureaucrats tell you that you ought to go in one field rather than another. And so there are a lot of serious problems about this. I look forward to your questions. I know I've given you a lot of information. It's kind of complicated. There's some op-eds that we've done in the Wall Street Journal in the last couple of years. There's been some columns done by George Will, a very well-regarded syndicated columnist over there that mentions the legal issues. But I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you this evening. I'm really grateful for people like Dean and Donna and Celia who set up these kinds of forums, because this is really the first step to begin to figure out how to extract ourselves from it. And the fact is that if lower performing states like South Carolina and Oklahoma, who had a lot less to lose than we did, if they can pull out, Massachusetts can pull out.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. A lot of information, a lot of acronyms in education policy. Framingham State, boy, every course it seemed that we did had laws, federal laws, state laws, acronyms. For the audience's benefit, what we're talking about here is MCAS versus PARCC, and we're talking about the old Massachusetts curriculum frameworks versus the Common Core standards or frameworks, which is basically both assessments and curriculum for an educator like myself to go implement to 105 eighth graders or 110 ninth graders in the social studies curriculum, which is not, as of yet, impacted directly by assessments, but Jamie can speak more about that as well. So those questions have to do with content and testing. But as Jamie mentioned, there's funding issues, there's sequencing issues. What year should we teach a certain subject to our kids? That's another question that our panel will talk about here tonight. Funding in this tight budget era that we're living in, both at the state and national level, is another issue. We know about Chapter 70 state funding. We know about local overrides or local issues as it relates to education. Special education, we hope that our panel will talk about that. I was lucky enough to do my student teaching in Ashland as a special inclusion aide in the classrooms, which was a benefit to get more classroom experience. So these are just some of the issues that we hope to cover tonight, and we're welcoming your questions. We're going to get the program to you at around 7:55, and we want to recognize our local officials here as well. But next is our next panelist, Dr. Sandra Stotsky is Professor of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas and the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality. She served on the Common Core's Validation Committee and on the National Mathematics Advisory Panel. She was a Senior Associate Commissioner in the Mass Department of Education from 1999 to 2003 and served on the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education from 2006 to 2010. Dr. Stotsky.
Thank you very much. Before I begin my talk, let me find out a little bit about who is here. How many of you have children in the schools today, K-12? Most of you. How many of you are elected officials, school committees, selectmen, or other? Any of you? We have a few. Okay. And how many of you you could be grandparents as well as having children in the school? We've got someone over there, good. And how many of you are other officials running for office, as well as, I think some of you are already in office. I think I met a few candidates for office. They're also here too. Okay, so we have some people who can execute policy, as well as those of you who are now watching what is happening to your children or grandchildren in the schools in the name of policy. Let me tell you just a little bit more about my background so you'll understand why I speak about the validation committee that I was on, which was one of the more bizarre experiences of my life, the way I do. I grew up in Bridgewater, which has an open town meeting, and I have lived in a community, Brookline, which has a representative town meeting, and I was a town meeting member for 10 years. That's an elected office. I was also a library trustee for 14 years in my community. So I know all about sunshine laws, what can be FOIA'd, Freedom of Information Act, susceptible, and the importance of having public meetings and being able to see all the feedback that one gets when there are votes for whatever has to be voted upon. I understand how civic procedures. I was also at one time president of my own League of Women Voters in Brookline. So I have been very well trained to understand democratic procedures, and just about all of them were violated by the validation committee I was on. Now, what was the function of this particular committee? Its purpose, it was one of 3 major meetings or groups set up by the Common Core developers. Its purpose, charged to the group that was less than 30 for the year, was to determine whether Common Core standards, as they were being developed in 09 and 10, were internationally benchmarked. That means comparable to the best that's out there in other high-achieving countries, that they were rigorous, and that they were research-based. And when we were first meeting as a group in 09, we were given a paper to sign called a confidentiality agreement that got me started off, because it was very clear this was a group unlike any other I had ever been on. We could never, for the rest of our lives, ever tell anybody about what happened in that group, what the committee did or didn't do, what it discussed, what it didn't discuss. This was the nature of the non-transparency that governed that committee and everything else that was done by the Common Core project, state systemic initiative, or standards initiative. And it's very clear, if any of you are in any way active with any groups, including PTOs or PTAs, that there are certain standard procedures you follow and that there is public knowledge of whatever you do. These standards were developed by private organizations funded by a private organization, the Gates Foundation, and no one will ever know why the people who were put on its committees and who were asked to write its standards were put on these committees. And that was why I immediately felt there was something wrong with the committee that wasn't going to be open and above board, as were all the standards that were developed here in Massachusetts when I was at the Department of Ed. You've already heard, this seems to be moving around a little bit. In any event, I will stand still, even if the platform moves, that there were private organizations in Washington, National Governors Association, Council for Chief State School Officers, and Achieve, a spin-off of the NGA, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who developed these national standards. Who selected the members of the standards development work groups? We don't know. To this day, we won't know who chose the people who were there. But we can tell you, because they had finally put out the list of names of those people on the groups, turned out that most of them were members of testing associations. Now, isn't that interesting? They're the one group making a whole lot of money out of all of this. And they were the ones developing our national standards. It was very strange that the media never picked this up to talk about, because this would have been, to me, one of the first things to raise questions about. Who chose them? Why were they there developing our standards? Who wasn't on the committee? High school math and English teachers, college-level literature professors. One would have expected those people to be on a committee to develop college readiness standards. Some of you want to still understand why there is so much commotion going on across the country, grassroots by parents, and why states are now beginning to pull out of Common Core. It is in part because it has been a rather bogus operation from the beginning, and it is not clear why we haven't had better information about why these people were chosen to begin with, because there are no records available. And where my concern was the greatest, because I had been involved in the Department of Education developing the standards that you have had in your schools until the last couple of years, for over 10 years, the qualifications of the people chosen to write the standards is something that you would have to puzzle about. The two people who are considered the chief ELA standards writers, David Coleman, Susan Pimentel, he has now gone on to become president of the College Board, where he will do exactly there what he did to K-12 ELA standards. Neither of them majored in English. Neither of them has a doctorate in English. Neither of them has ever published anything about curriculum and instruction. Neither of them had ever taught in either K-12 or above. And yet they were chosen to write the standards that English teachers must teach by. In math, we had a somewhat better possibility. Two of the people who wrote the standards in math had PhDs in math. They could understand the math they were writing, even though they had never taught in K-12 before. The third person on that math writing committee was an English major. Now, go figure that one out. No one ever raised a question in the media about that. So we had bizarre things from the very beginning, including the products that came out. And I'll get to those in a minute, but I want to go to the validation committee right now, because that committee, almost 30 people, had exactly one mathematician on it. You've heard a lot about parents being very concerned about the math that their kids are getting in the elementary school. Most of the people who are called math experts who are on the validation committee are educators, people with doctoral degrees or other higher degrees in mathematics education. There was one mathematician, James Milgram, you've heard his name mentioned before. He refused to sign off. I was the only English language arts standards expert, and I refused to sign off. The other people represented varieties of different areas. Some of them were from abroad. There were at least 4 people who came from other countries. Why they were on our standards the Common Core Validation Committee, I still don't know. But we did not have the kind of representation that one would expect a committee that was charged to make sure that standards were research-based, rigorous for our kids, and internationally benchmarked, which means that you have a crosswalk or a comparison that shows sets of standards at different grade levels from other high-achieving countries. What was the purpose so far as we could figure out? And the mathematician Jim Milgram and I used to talk a lot about what was going on. We knew something was going on, we just couldn't figure out what. Turns out that we were to be rubber stamps. We would simply sign off so that Common Core could state that indeed its standards were internationally benchmarked, even though we never received anything to suggest that they were. Who has somehow bought this whole hog? The U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I have no idea why, but they keep sending out ads, putting out promotions about these internationally benchmarked standards we have that are not internationally benchmarked. And I have finally figured out it's because they don't know how to read a set of high school math standards. Let me ask you as an audience, how many of you feel comfortable in looking at a set of high school mathematics standards? You told me you majored in math, so I can understand that you would raise your hand. And a couple of other people. Can you tell me what, are you an engineer or a scientist? Mathematician? Okay. So those are the kind of people who can read a set of math standards. Who can't read them? I can't. The Board of Education can't read them. Most people who vote on these documents can't even read a set of math standards at the high school level. You'd have to be either in engineering, science, or in mathematics itself to be able to understand that the topics that you need for a pre-calculus course aren't there. And that was what Professor Milgram, who's a mathematician at Stanford, said. He said there's no way to get to a calculus course from the weak Algebra 2 course that is there, the top of where Common Core goes. Now, what does that mean practically? It means that if you have children in high school, in the next few years, they may be able to finish whatever the math sequence was that your high school had. But in a few years, American students in high school, unless they go to special high schools that have made sure they're keeping something between Algebra 2 and calculus there in the curriculum, they won't be able to have a STEM major, science, technology, engineering, and math. To this day, we do not know why those standards were not put into that document. We were supposed to be internationally competitive. We were supposed to be increasing the STEM pipeline. Instead, we're shrinking it. We don't know why, and no one seems to ask the people who wrote these standards why they didn't put in the right standards for these kinds of courses that, of course, should be in our high schools as courses. Not required for graduation. Remember, these are not high school graduation standards. These are college readiness. And what does that mean? Because this is going to be a drama that continually unfolds. It means that students who pass a college readiness test, which could be PARC, in grade 11, if they pass the test, once we know where the cut score, pass score, is going to be, they will be able to take their freshman courses in college for credit. Now, if cut score, the pass score, on the math test is somewhere between grade 8 and Algebra 1, what is going to be the course they take for credit in math when they go to college? Colleges are going to have to make sure that they provide courses that they can take for credit. We don't know yet what's going to happen to our STEM majors who need to begin with more advanced math and science. By the way, science is being very heavily affected also, as you can well imagine, by the lowering of the math rigor in Common Core. And you are getting peculiar stories from departments of education all over the country. They are telling you the standards are more rigorous, that students are being asked to spend more time explaining what they're doing. That may be true, but the question is, are they learning more math? That's going to be up to your high school math department to explain, because your superintendent, unless that person is a mathematician or scientist, is not going to be able to explain what's happening in your math and science departments either. Let me briefly explain what I saw as the major problems with ELA, and then I will stop because I'd rather have some questions from you. Major flaws, English language arts for Common Core. And if you have children in lower grade, you're going to see some of these issues. They stress writing more than reading. I'm sure your children are doing a lot of writing. Even mathematics has been turned into a semi-language arts class, as you ask children to do a lot of explaining of whatever it is they've been asked to solve as a problem. Common Core has reduced literary study to about 50% of the reading instructional curriculum, and the other half will be something called informational text, which could be almost anything in the secondary grades. It has opened the floodgate for a lot of very peculiar kinds of reading that are called informational. Part of the goal, it was claimed, was to develop critical thinking. But where does critical thinking come from? I have been involved in the English language arts and reading almost all of my professional life. If you asked teachers and students, where do you learn to do analytical reading and writing, they would probably point, if they had to point to one place, to reading complex literary texts and having English teachers help you learn how to read between the lines. That's where analytical reading and writing gets developed. It doesn't get developed by looking at a history textbook, reading a math textbook or science textbook. Textbooks are designed to convey information, so you don't learn to do analytical reading with that kind of material. That's the basis for getting it developed. So where do you get to learn how to do critical thinking, which means that you have some body of knowledge about something with which you use to criticize something or critique something? We don't know where it's going to come from because it's not built into the ELA standards. They are called fewer, clearer, and deeper. But as I have looked at them and had to write reports on them, they are not fewer, they're certainly not clearer, and they're not deeper. They're simply called that. It's just that we have very trusting people all across this country who believe what they're told. When you count up and look at a standard that has semicolons or colons in the middle of it, then you know you've got a number of different activities that have been bunched together. I've done that. I know the trick. But that doesn't mean that you have fewer standards. It simply means you've reduced a number of different things to something that looks like one sentence. And the math has the same problem that the ELA standards have. Now, I'm going to end there because I think we ought to have questions on whatever questions you might have about what local school boards can do who still have almost the same responsibilities and powers that they have had for about 200 to 300 years in this country. Local school boards are elected school officials who have a direct relationship to you parents in your local school district. And they can set policy on curriculum and instruction and standards for your local school district to this day, even if you have been told otherwise. And so I hope you will think about what it is you can do to make sure that you have better standards available for your children's teachers to teach to. Thank you. Oh, these are yours. Notes there. Is that all yours?
Sandy took some of my notes here. You have to be ready for class, right? Well, at this time, we still have one panelist. We're going to get to Donna in a couple minutes. I do want to recognize some of the local officials that are here tonight. Kelly Knight, who's on the Hopkinton School Committee, is here. Kelly, are you in the audience? Hi, thank you. Thanks for coming to our event. Lori Nickerson. Lori, thank you very much. John Graziano. On the Hopkinton School Committee, we appreciate them being here tonight. We have a representative from Senator Karen Spilka's office, Chief of Staff. Is she here tonight? And your first name? Thank you, Marianne, for being here. I see State Representative Carolyn Dykema for being here. Thank you very much. We'll ask some of these people to come up in a second to say hello. We have Brian Herr here tonight from Hopkinton. Brian, thanks for coming. And Trish Veneria is here in the front row, taking good notes. Thank you for coming. Did I miss any local official from Hopkinton or surrounding community? Okay, so we'll continue. We're going to get to you, and I hope we're generating a lot of questions. I do want to give some of our special guests here 45 seconds to a minute, and start with Brian Herr. Come on up. It's always good as a teacher to go around and ask for class participation.
So I know most of the folks in the room tonight, and most of you know I'm running for the United States Senate. I'm here tonight to learn more about Common Core. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask at the appropriate time. I don't think that's now.
Couple minutes.
With that, I think you all probably know that I'm a local control person, and what I've heard this evening concerns me, but I'd like to ask a couple of questions before I offer any other opinions. So with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments from your office? Thank you very much. We do have a microphone that we're going to be circulating around, so if you want the microphone, if you want to be heard, if you want to wake people up, that's okay. And then our next person, Trish, if you want to say a few words.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, everybody, panelists especially. Trish Venarian, I'm running for state rep. I do have a question also, but I guess I'll ask it later as well. I just wonder if Bill Gates had used this similar business model when he was developing his company early on, that business model being development by inexperienced people, leaving experts off the panel, or if you do include them, not listening to them, doing no vetting or research, and no cost projections. I have a feeling we'd all be using Macs right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Representative Dykema, if you want to say a few words. We do have a mic.
I'm Carolyn Dykema, proud to represent the community of Hopkinton, which I have to say, thanks to many people in this room, is one of the top school districts in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you all for contributing to that. I'm also a parent of 3 children in all public schools, very proud of that. I know education is very important for this district. It's been something that I've worked very closely with the community to make sure that we are
Thank you. Thank you. We are very close to our Q&A session, so if any of the school committee members want to just say a brief word now or wait to the question part, Kelly, Lori, John, the floor is yours if you want to say, give us a 45-second introduction or wait to the question period.
So, John Bradley, and I'll just say again, thanks for putting this on. Mostly just here to listen. I think these opportunities for information are great. I know that the area superintendents are also trying to put together a forum later in the month for the tech collaborative, so hopefully people will come out to that as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Kelly, Lori, if you want to say a few words to start us off. Get the microphone going here. Thank you. Yeah, we can tell from our panel, and I participated with this panel in a Tewksbury event in the other part of our state, and you can see that it's just more than just standards. As I said in the opening, it affects curriculum, special ed, funding, testing, sequencing of courses, all of that is impacted. And when we're talking about 2/3 of our locality's budget, I think it's an important forum to have. Which leads me to our final panelist, Donna Colorio. Served on the Worcester School Committee from 2011 to 2013. She is an adjunct sociology and psychology faculty member at Quinsigamond Community College, and she's a member of the MTA. Donna is the founder of CommonCoreForum.org, and Donna will talk tonight about what Common Core Forum is all about, which, along with our local sponsors, put on tonight's event. And we thank Cecilia and her team and everyone else involved locally for having us tonight. Donna.
I want to first say thank you so much for coming out tonight. And I mean that sincerely because we do have such an eclectic group here. I really, I thank the state representative for being here, the state senate's office, the candidates, and the school committees. It's really important that we're all together in the same room, especially us parents. So, that being said, I am an adjunct professor at Quinsigamond Community College. I've been there for 22 years. I am a former school committee member. I was at I served on the Worcester School Committee. Most importantly, I am a mother of 3, and I have a daughter who is presently a sophomore at a Worcester public school. I am also the founder of a newly formed citizen parent-run group called the CommonCoreForum.org. I first began learning about Common Core when I was running for school committee in 2010. One of the first questions that was asked of me was, what do you think of the Common Core? I did a little Google search. I came up with a few little facts, and I said, well, you know, it's a one-size-fits-all thing. I don't like it. That was it. Kind of got dropped. And you know, I'm really glad to see school committee members here, because when you first get elected, you really don't have a good grasp of everything. So the first job I had, I was appointed chair of the Finance and Operations Committee. And I'm telling you this because being on a standing or a subcommittee, you can see close up where the numbers come from. So I was seeing where we were getting money for the schools and where we were spending money for the schools. Now, Worcester's school committee budget is about $325 million, so a little bit higher than here. So I noticed that as I was doing like a historical sort of overview of the budget, and I was reviewing past budgets, we were increasing our budget. Our budget was increasing tremendously. But the key was our discretionary money was decreasing. So that's kind of weird. We have more money, but we have less money to spend on our kids. So after a lot of research, I realized, like most school committee budgets, we were anchored with unfunded mandates, one after another after another. Every time I turned around, we were having to put out money for this, have to put money out for this. So when I questioned my colleagues that had been on the school committee, I don't know, one was on for 30 years, I said, well, why are we doing this? And he said, oh, well, we haven't had control over our budget since ed reform. Forget it. We don't have control over curriculum, we don't have control over the budget, we just kind of, you know, we just hired the superintendent. That was my job, that's what they told me. So I felt at first we were trapped, and we couldn't get out of it. But I realized that our jobs were much bigger being a school committee member. We had control, and we had a vote on what we could implement as a curriculum. So after I did a lot more research and I started to become much more aware, I spent a lot of time, I've been to the Joint Committee in Boston on education. I have been to testify at the Department of Education. I've been very active on the state level. I just attended the Massachusetts Teachers Association conference 2 days, so I've spoke to many people throughout the state. So I realized that the school committee member has local power and control, and that was something that Sandra Stotsky was just getting to at the end of her speech. So my daughter, let me just flip back for a little bit. My daughter's at a school now, a local school, and the kids that loved math hate math. The teachers can't teach the Common Core standards. They're having a very difficult time conveying these standards to the students. And I looked at it as like these classrooms now are turning into like these testing environments, not learning environments. And that's really important. If you think that the teachers were teaching to the test with MCAS, now with PARC, it's going to tie into their teacher evaluations. So if their student is not performing, then their teacher evaluation is going to be tied into this. And this is really important to note, because now what happens is, I know myself, 22 years, sometimes I get a great group of kids. They're motivated, they're smart, they're intelligent, they're going great. And then other times, just by the luck, I get a really group of kids that have no motivation. Does that mean I am a better teacher this semester than I was last semester, or vice versa? So now teachers are going to teach to the test. And one of the things that Sandra Stotsky mentioned was this informational test sort of thing. I had my daughter come home the other day and she said, Mom, I have to write a paper. I said, okay, what's your paper on? She goes, the Worcester Public School Policy Handbook. I said, whoa, that is exciting. Now, I worked on that policy handbook, and it is not exciting, let me tell you. And I also know that I have a little bit of a background in policy. I also know the history of education reform. So I have, I would say, about an average intelligence when it comes to policy and education. So I said to my daughter, so what are you going to write about? She says, oh, I just have to take a paragraph out of that and write about it. I said, honey, what did you learn about policy? Nothing. What did you learn about education reform? How did we get these great policies? Nothing. So I started to sit back and I said, okay, Common Core, come on, calm down. And the analogy that just just so perfect to me was she's building a house without any foundation. And at one point, this house is going to collapse because she has no content on education reform, educational policy, or why did we extend recess 10 minutes? Does she know it was a school committee member that blah, 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 blah? No one knew. I know the background on that, but did she? No. So I thought that was very interesting. So getting back to one of the things that Dee mentioned, in March this year, I'm kind of flip-flopping all around, I started a statewide, nonpartisan, volunteer, citizen, and parent group. And I thought it would be good to join throughout the state, parents, educators, and citizens, and get out there and start talking about the Common Core and putting together these forums. In the 3 months that I've been doing this, I have probably talked to over 1,000 people, and not one parent has jumped up out of the audience and say, I love the Common Core, and let me tell you why. Not once. The only people that have told me they love the Common Core, and they haven't told me directly, but I've been on panels with them, has been the administrators that have to do it because it's part of their job, those that are receiving the stipends from Park, or the new teachers that, and it's no fault of theirs, but they've never been under the old Massachusetts standards. They've just come on board in the last 2 years, so they don't know what it's like to teach on the high Massachusetts standards. So the next month, I know many school committees will be out there trying to decide whether they're going to adopt the Park or the MCAS, or continue with the MCAS. And this is a very important decision. I would encourage all of you as parents to do your homework and then go to your school committees and call them up and have a conversation with them and tell them what you want, and talk to your state reps, talk to the people that are in control of policy. I think that this is really an important, a time in our history where we have to really say our voices need to be heard. And this is a short-lived thing. You may say, well, you know, maybe I'll get on board with this in a month or so. Well, this is short-lived. Within a year, Massachusetts is either going to go full implementation or it's not. So I would encourage you all, if you get a chance, go on the website, commoncoreforum.org, or sign up for a newsletter, or if you want a lawn sign in your lawn, we're doing lawn signs and bumper stickers now, you know, to really get the word out. And, you know, I'll be around later if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Okay, so here we are. We have our microphone. Mr. Microphone person is ready. I have my red pen, just joking. My notes are in red, so you can tell where I'm coming from. So here we are. We would ask that you state your first name and direct your question to one of our panelists, or have more of a general question, and we would be happy to answer that and kind of move around the room as needed. So with that, may I have the first volunteer? First question. Mr. Herr.
So 2 quick questions specific to the MTA. Has the leadership taken a position on Common Core? What is that position?
Yes. Yes, that's it. Can you hear me? Okay, that's a great question. The newly elected president is a woman out of Northampton who ran on an anti-Common Core stance, and she is actually standardized testing also. So with the new leadership, will bring, I believe, a whole different perspective to the table. I was there at the vote, and she won by a good margin. It wasn't like a 20 vote margin. There were so many people fired up at that convention that it was amazing. Worcester usually sends 9 delegates from Worcester. We had 52 delegates that we sent because people were so engrossed. These are teachers that are in the classroom and saying, we can't really speak up because we have like a gag order. We have to go through our union delegates. So we are here and we can speak freely, and we can say that we do not want the Common Core or the PARCC testing.
So outside the leadership, have the members ever taken a vote?
Well, these were the, well, the membership there was a small percentage of the membership pre-implementation. MTA did, I think it was 3,000 out of the 110,000. I don't know, can someone do that math? Not the Common Core way, the other way. Can we, what's the percentage? But they took a vote and they voted, there was mostly the administrators that they voted in favor. This was pre-implementation. Now the new leadership is demanding that they broaden their horizons and they get a vote from the whole body of MTA members.
Why Oklahoma and South Carolina, is that your question, are the first states to get rid of Common Core rather than Massachusetts? This is all hypothetical because we have no basis for saying exactly why something is happening. But there are, in some parts of the country, and I did live part of the year in Arkansas for 5 years and came to realize that it's a very different culture compared to New England. But local control issues are extremely strong in some parts of the country, and they have a long tradition of resenting faraway bureaucracies making decisions for them. This is something you will hear the Governor Fallon saying in her recent today's speech, explaining, from what I read or heard, we were in the car coming here as we were reading what she said for her press release, why she signed the bill. She is talking about the people of Oklahoma and their relationship to bureaucracies making decisions for them. You would have to know that that is a very rural state, as was Arkansas. So you're dealing with lots of little tiny towns where people make their own decisions all the time. This is very different from a very urban area. And I realized after living there that we have very serious cultural differences across this country. The more west you go, and I've been speaking in many western states all the way up to California, they have very different understandings than we have in New England about how they see themselves in relation to state government and to the federal government. And it's elusive, it's hard to pin down. Reporters can capture it better, but there are more concerns. They know their constituents, the representatives, they're closer. They have a smaller population. I mean, there just are cultural differences in the relationship people have with their representatives. They talk about federalism with a meaning. I found people who would be quoting in Arkansas letters to the newspaper, Madison, Jefferson. I mean, it's still living to them. They're in some ways maybe part of the 19th century, but this is all very meaningful to them. They understand U.S. history and local control a lot better than we do, I think, in this part of the world.
Okay, we're gonna take a few more questions. Before we get to that, since we've done a couple of forums like this before and we've covered a lot of ground, there is one issue that did not come up is data and the whole piece. We have the question over there. So do you want to ask the question?
All right, you got it.
Okay. In the corner there.
I just want to understand this better, and I think it was Mr. Gass that mentioned this about the gathering of 200 pieces of data
So, as I mentioned, we released a paper just a couple of weeks ago. It's an 80-page paper. It's got 480 footnotes in it. It was written by a woman who lives in Georgia, who's an attorney who went to Harvard Law School, and another attorney who is in Washington, D.C. And they map this out in a lot more detail than I can just in a couple of minutes. But it's called COGS. The name of the paper is called COGS in the Machine. You can go to the Pioneer website. It's pioneerinstitute.org. You can also Google a woman named Jane Robbins and data collection, and you can see a YouTube video that she has done, and I think it's gotten something like 30,000 views. But she maps out in a lot of detail. The fact of it is that Achieve Inc., the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the big advocates behind Common Core, really don't view K-12 education so much as an academic exercise, but as and they've had this opinion, and you can look at their websites and their research and the things they've advocated for a long time. They really see K-12 education as workforce development. That's what they really believe. Part of what Massachusetts did over the last 20 years is really rescue education in this state from this skills-based workforce development approach. I mean, kids that pick vocational technical schools as their choice and want to go and do that, that's one thing. But to try to kind of slap this workforce development grid over all of K-12 education, that's really the outlook. And the fact of it is that has not worked. One of the reasons why the country has declined in K-12 education is that a lot of the advocates around education have believed we need to kind of move away from academics, that it's 19th century, it's outdated for the information society or the information age. You need to have all of these skills, soft skills, they call them 21st century skills. I mean, it turns out, look, you need to write, you know how to read and manipulate, numbers and mathematics. These are enduring pieces of knowledge and abilities that you want kids to develop. But I'd encourage you to read the report, Google Jane Robbins. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to send you the report. But it is a troubling development, and the problem is that the federal government is prohibited from collecting these kinds of data on our children, so they have brushed aside the FERPA laws, the parental privacy laws, and really what they really have done through this race to the top federal grant that is how we signed on to Common Core and to the national testing, is that they've basically made the states start collecting this data that then they will then turn over to the federal government. I mean, that's a kind of a clumsy way of answering your question, which is a very good one and an important one. But the fact of it is a different outlook from the Sandy Stotsky, Tom Birmingham, Bill Weld model of Massachusetts in the 90s, which we know has led to success. It's a different way of viewing education and our children, frankly.
Okay, so go ahead.
We don't know, and I'm not sure they really know, but they really believe if, they have all of this data on our children, that they can start directing kids towards careers that they think that either kids have an aptitude for or that they think we need to compete in the 21st century. And there's nothing really in the history of this country that supports that point of view. It is something you find in some Eastern European or Western European countries, and it is something that these people believe it. I mean, it's a sort of mystical belief, actually, but it's really out of keeping with the tradition of this country, where people and citizens get to pick what it is that they get to do for a living.
Okay, so we'll be wrapping up now, and I know Donna wants to say a few words, and we'll give Dr. Stotsky a chance for 20 more seconds. And we want to thank our local hosts for tonight and all of your good questions and local officials that participated as well. Donna.
I have just two things to say to your point. It's never too late to undo a bad decision. Remember whole language. Remember whole language. Remember the bad decisions we've made in the curriculum and the standards before. We can undo it. We just need more parents to be aware of it, because the talking points we're getting is that this is a done deal. It is not a done deal. Now, if this hasn't inspired you or you want to learn more, we have a great speaker coming in on Monday, June 9th, Duke Pesta. He will be in Shrewsbury at the Floral Street School. We have flyers up there. He's an excellent speaker. He spoke all throughout the country, and you can really learn a little bit more. So I just want to thank you for having us here. And Dr. Stotsky, would you like to say anything, closing remarks?
No, I just thank all of you for coming and for showing an interest in the education of your children. I was one of those tiger moms in the community I lived in, and believe me, the school system knew me because I was looking at what was happening to my 5 children every day. So I appreciate having parents today who are doing the same thing.
And I just would like to echo that, and again, I want to thank Cecilia and Dean and Donna and all of you for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.